"Congresswoman, with all due respect," Alan Dershowitz sneered, his voice dripping with the kind of polished condescension that only decades of prestige can perfect. "A law degree from your school hardly compares to Harvard. Let's not pretend we're on the same playing field." The words landed like a thunderclap. The air inside the chamber grew heavy, taut with the sting of elitism. A few nervous chuckles slipped from the corners of the room, but they were quickly drowned by the low rumble of murmurs. Heads turned, eyebrows raised, cameras zoomed in. Every lens in the place was suddenly hunting for a reaction, for the flicker of humiliation they expected on Jasmine Crockett's face. Dershowitz leaned back in his chair, smugness settling in like an old friend. To him, this was routine, a professor's flourish, a reminder of the ivory tower he stood upon. To him, mocking the credentials of a young black congresswoman was not cruelty, but sport. But for the audience, for every immigrant family watching, for every student paying off loans from a state university, for every dreamer told their education wasn't enough, the moment pierced deeper. It wasn't just Crockett he was dismissing. It was them, their schools, their sacrifices, their worth. The silence after his jab carried a dangerous weight. It was the silence of a crowd unsure whether to recoil or to rise. Reporters scribbled, furiously, already imagining tomorrow's headlines. "Dershowitz belittles Crockett." A flashbulb popped, another followed. The story was writing itself in real time, and through it all, Crockett sat still, her hands folded, her eyes steady. No smirk, no tremor, no rush to defend. Only composure, only patience. Dershowitz mistook her calm for weakness. He thought the silence meant victory. He thought the room belonged to him. But there was a shift, subtle, invisible, yet undeniable. It began with the crowd leaning in, as if they knew something he didn't. It spread with the anticipation crackling between each pause of Crockett's breath. Because what happened next would not just flip the debate. It would not just silence the sneer. It would leave even Dershowitz's allies stunned. In Washington, credentials are currency. They are waved like weapons, engraved on business cards, plastered on resumes, and whispered in introductions before a single argument is made. And no credential gleams brighter in the eyes of the elite than Harvard law. Alan Dershowitz knew that better than anyone. For decades, he had wielded the name as both shield and sword, reminding anyone who challenged him that his pedigree alone placed him above reproach. But politics is not a classroom, and democracy is not confined to ivy-covered walls. Jasmine. Crockett's law degree may not have carried the Harvard crest, but it carried something weightier: lived experience. It carried the story of a daughter of Texas, a public defender, a woman who walked into courtrooms not with prestige but with grit, who didn't represent power but the powerless. And that was what made this clash so much more than a petty academic insult. It wasn't just Dershowitz sneering at Crockett, it was the establishment sneering at every voice that came from the margins, every community college graduate, every first-generation lawyer, every immigrant who clawed their way into the system not through elite connections but through sleepless nights and stubborn resilience. The room felt that tension. Some nodded in quiet disapproval at Dershowitz's jab, recognizing the stench of elitism that had poisoned politics for generations. Others smirked, waiting to see if Crockett would crumble under the weight of the comparison. For those watching at home, the stakes loomed even larger. Viewers saw in Crockett a reflection of themselves, people who had been told they weren't qualified enough, polished enough, connected enough to belong at the table. They knew this was bigger than a sparring match between two lawyers. This was a cultural fault line, America's entrenched hierarchy versus America's promise of equality, and Crockett knew it too. Every measured breath she took was more than composure. It was strategy. She didn't need to match Dershowitz's arrogance with rage. She didn't need to scream to command attention. She understood that the louder he boasted of Harvard, the smaller he made himself. Because when credentials are used as clubs, they reveal less about the strength of the argument and more about the weakness of the man holding them. The cameras stayed trained on her face. Reporters whispered to each other, "Will she fight back?" The audience leaned closer. The weight of history pressed down on her shoulders. But Crockett had carried heavier loads before. This wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated. As a young attorney, she'd been dismissed in courtrooms by men who barely glanced her way. As a candidate, she'd been written off as unelectable, too young, too brash, too different. Yet, time and again, she had flipped those doubts into fuel, transforming skepticism into victories. And that history was about to repeat itself. Because if Alan Dershowitz thought a Harvard crest could shield him from what was coming, he was gravely mistaken. But Crockett had been underestimated before, and that mistake never ended well for her opponents. Alan Dershowitz's name had long been etched into the marble halls of American law. To his admirers, he was the archetype of legal brilliance, the Harvard professor who lectured with a razor-sharp wit, the courtroom tactician who dazzled juries, the celebrity defender who never backed down from a fight. He had advised presidents, argued before the Supreme Court, and stood beside some of the most notorious figures in modern history. His resume gleamed like polished ivory, and he carried it with the smug ease of a man convinced of his own invincibility. In lecture halls, his words commanded silence. In television studios, his face was instantly recognizable, his voice a fixture in political debates. His Harvard pedigree was more than an accomplishment, it was his weapon of choice. He brandished it with a sneer, an unspoken reminder that he belonged to a world that most Americans could never touch. To challenge him was to challenge the institution itself. Over the decades, Dershowitz perfected the art of condescension. His debates followed a familiar script: praise himself, diminish. His opponent overwhelmed them with references to his decades of scholarship, and then watch as they wilted under the weight of his credentials. It worked, time and again. Young attorneys, activists, even seasoned politicians often found themselves cornered, their arguments overshadowed by his pedigree. He was the gatekeeper of legitimacy, deciding who was worthy to speak and who was not, and he relished it. Interviews were delivered with the smug grin of a man certain he was the smartest in the room. Panels became arenas where he wielded words like cudgels, mocking those who dared contradict him. The more controversial his takes, the louder he grew. Critics fumed, admirers cheered, and Dershowitz basked in the attention. To his detractors, he embodied the arrogance of the American elite, the belief that education at a handful of gilded institutions conferred moral superiority, that ordinary struggles meant nothing compared to the sheen of Ivy League credentials. He often dismissed grassroots voices, scoffed at the idea that lived experience could rival scholarly expertise. For him, power wasn't just about law, it was about status. But status has a shelf life, and arrogance always leaves cracks. As years passed, Dershowitz's career grew increasingly defined not by groundbreaking cases, but by his hunger for the spotlight. He became a regular on cable news, an eager participant in the outrage economy. Each appearance carried the same undertone. He was untouchable, above reproach, the final word in any debate. What he failed to see was the shift happening beneath his feet. The America he once lectured to was changing. New voices were rising. Women, people of color, first-generation professionals, who carried with them not Harvard prestige, but hard-earned experience. They spoke to audiences that Dershowitz could not reach, with authenticity he could not manufacture. And those audiences were tired of being told their degrees, their schools, their backgrounds were inferior. Still, Dershowitz pressed on, oblivious. He clung to his well-worn tactics, convinced they would never fail him. That arrogance is what led him to Jasmine Crockett. To him, she was just another challenger to belittle, another resume to mock, another voice to trample beneath the weight of his Harvard crest, But what he did not grasp was that Crockett wasn't playing his game. She wasn't intimidated by the walls of academia, nor swayed by the glitter of celebrity cases. She had built her credibility in places far harsher than classrooms and TV studios. In courtrooms where lives hung in the balance, in neighborhoods where the law was often weaponized against the powerless. Her legitimacy came not from ivy-covered towers, but from the people she served. And so, when Dershowitz leaned forward, dripping arrogance, mocking her law degree with the same dismissive flourish he had used on countless opponents, he thought history would repeat itself. He thought she would bow, stammer, retreat. Instead, he was setting himself up for a reckoning. Because even giants can stumble. And Dershowitz had just set the stage for his own undoing. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the marble halls of Harvard or with a silver spoon resting on her plate. It began in Texas, in neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce and the law often felt like something wielded against people, not for them. She was not born into privilege. She was born into struggle, into a world where every inch of progress had to be earned through perseverance, where every room she entered was filled with the weight of low expectations. From an early age, Crockett understood what it meant to be underestimated. Teachers, peers, even strangers assumed her future would be limited, but she carried something they could not measure on a test or reduce to a transcript: resilience. It was the resilience of a daughter who had watched her community bruised by inequality and knew that her life had to mean more than survival. When she chose law, it was not for prestige, but for purpose. She did not dream of climbing the ranks, of elite firms, or chasing fame through high-profile cases. She dreamed of being a defender, of standing between ordinary people and the machinery of a system that too often crushed them. Law school was not a finishing school for the privileged. It was her proving ground. Every exam passed, every class conquered was another strike against the voices that had told her she didn't belong. Graduating and stepping into the role of a public defender, she found herself in courtrooms where the stakes were painfully real. These were not academic debates or theoretical exercises. These were lives. Parents, sons, daughters, all standing on the precipice of futures that could be defined by a single judgment. Crockett fought for them not because it was glamorous, but because it was right. She did not measure her victories in headlines. She measured them in second chances, in lives restored, in communities healed. But her battles did not end in the courtroom. In Texas politics, she found herself facing a different kind of trial. The State House was filled with men twice her age and twice as certain of their own authority. They looked at her, young, black, female, and dismissed her before she even spoke. They thought her voice would be drowned out by theirs, that she would wither beneath the heat of political combat. They were wrong. Crockett sharpened her instincts in those halls. She learned to navigate the rough currents of partisanship, to stand firm when others tried to shout her down, to wield her words with precision rather than volume. Each debate became another crucible, each dismissal another reason to rise. She was not merely a participant in politics, she was a disruptor. Her very presence challenged the old guard. Her perspective carved new space for those who had long been silenced. The path from Texas to Congress was not smooth. She faced skepticism from voters, from media, from colleagues who whispered that she was too inexperienced, too brash, too unapologetically herself. But Crockett refused to trim her identity to fit the mold. She leaned into it. She embraced the sharp edges of her story, the daughter of Texas, the defender of the vulnerable, the voice that could not be ignored. And the people responded. They saw in her a reflection of their own struggles, their own grit, their own refusal to accept that power belonged only to the privileged. When she walked into the halls of Congress, she carried more than a title. She carried generations of dreams deferred, of communities overlooked, of people told they weren't enough. She knew every glance of doubt cast her way was the same doubt that had chased her all her life. And she also knew that she had already proven those doubts wrong. That was what made her so dangerous to someone like Alan Dershowitz. He could mock her degree, belittle her credentials, dismiss her experience. But Crockett's power did not come from a crest on a diploma. It came from battles fought in real time, from scars earned on the ground, from victories that no headline could diminish. So when Dershowitz took aim at her law degree, she did not flinch. She had heard it all before, in classrooms where she was underestimated, in courtrooms where she was underestimated, in the State House where she was underestimated. His words were not new. His arrogance was not unique, and that was his fatal mistake. Because Crockett was not a woman who withered in the face of arrogance. She was a woman who thrived on it. For her, dismissal was fuel, mockery was oxygen, and underestimation was the very soil in which her strength had grown. The cameras that day captured more than a confrontation. They captured the story of two Americas colliding, one clinging to old symbols of power, the other rising on the strength of authenticity and lived truth. Crockett embodied the latter, her poise forged in fire, her voice sharpened by years of proving herself against the odds. And when the moment came, her calm precision would slice through arrogance like a scalpel. The air in the chamber was already charged, but with every passing second it thickened, pressing down on the shoulders of everyone present. The insult still lingered, like smoke after a fire, and instead of softening his tone, Alan Dershowitz leaned forward, emboldened by the silence. His smirk widened, his voice booming with the certainty of a man convinced the room belonged to him. "You see, this is the problem," he declared, gesturing broadly as though lecturing a classroom of undergrads. "We're letting people with, let's say, subpar credentials dictate serious legal discussions. That is not how justice is built. That is not how America functions." The words dripped with elitism, each syllable designed to belittle, each pause engineered for effect. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing his every movement, the smug tilt of his head, the glint of superiority in his eyes. Reporters scribbled notes, sensing the quote would dominate headlines. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. The restraint itself was dramatic. The more Dershowitz talked, the more the spotlight shifted. The audience began to see the contrast, his arrogance inflating like a balloon, her patience sharpening like a blade. Dershowitz mistook her silence for submission. He grew louder, pressing his advantage. "This isn't personal," he said, though his tone betrayed the opposite. "It's about standards. It's about what separates serious legal minds from politicians who think passing a bar exam makes them equals." He chuckled to himself, a hollow laugh that echoed. Off the walls, gasps rippled across the room. A few of his allies smirked nervously, but others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They could feel it. The arrogance was overshooting, tipping into cruelty. The line between confidence and condescension had blurred, and Dershowitz was crossing it with every sentence. Meanwhile, Crockett let him speak. She knew the rhythm well, the arrogance that swells just before it collapses under its own weight. She had seen it in courtrooms, in state houses, in debates where men like Dershowitz assumed their words alone could flatten her resolve. What he didn't see, what he couldn't see, was that every insult only made the silence around her more deafening, more powerful. The crowd felt it too. Reporters leaned forward, pens hovering, waiting. Staffers whispered to each other, their eyes darting between the professor and the congresswoman. Attention built not from Crockett's words, but from her absence of them. She was coiled, calm, waiting. Dershowitz kept talking, circling the same insult, layering it with exaggerated authority. "We cannot confuse activism with expertise. We cannot confuse rhetoric with rigor, and we cannot, under any circumstances, place the judgment of politicians above the wisdom of scholars." He sat back in his chair with a final flourish, his smirk settling back into place as if he had delivered a crushing blow. The silence afterward was suffocating. Everyone knew the script. The professor lands his point, the opponent fumbles. But Crockett did not fumble. She did not stammer. She simply inhaled, steady and deliberate. The audience leaned in, restless now, sensing that the silence was not weakness but tension. A bow pulled back, waiting to release. Reporters gripped their pens tighter. Cameras zoomed in. Even Dershowitz's allies shifted, sensing something in the air they couldn't quite name. Because silence, when wielded well, is not absence. It is power, and Jasmine Crockett was about to wield it with precision. And then, with the entire room holding its breath, she struck. The silence stretched, and for a moment it felt like the oxygen had been sucked from the room. All eyes locked on Jasmine Crockett, the congresswoman who had sat in silence while Dershowitz filled the chamber with the sound of his own confidence. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. She simply looked up, her expression calm, almost surgical, as if she had been waiting her entire career for this very moment. "Professor Dershowitz," she began, her voice steady but carrying a weight that drew every ear closer. "You seem very interested in talking about credentials. So, let's talk about them." The room shifted, pens scratched faster against paper. Reporters glanced at one another, sensing that something was about to snap. Crockett's tone wasn't defensive. It was deliberate, precise. A scalpel, not a hammer. "I earned my law degree from the Thurgood Marshall School of Law," she continued. "I didn't inherit my way into it. I worked my way into it. I sat for the Texas bar and I passed it. And since you care so much about the courtroom, let me remind you, I've won cases there. Real people, real stakes, not just theory." A ripple of murmurs swept across the chamber. Someone in the back whispered, "She got him," and the phrase caught, spreading like a spark. Dershowitz shifted in his seat just slightly, shuffling a paper that didn't need shuffling. The smirk that had seemed carved into his face faltered, if only for a second. Crockett pressed forward, her delivery smooth, each word landing with precision. "You've spent decades in ivory towers and television studios, Professor. I've spent mine in courtrooms, standing beside clients who didn't have a name, didn't have money, and didn't have anyone else to defend them. You quote theory. I've lived practice." The crowd exhaled audibly. A few quiet claps slipped from the corners of the room, quickly muffled but unmistakable. She paused. Let the silence breathe. Let Dershowitz stew in the stillness he had once thought was his ally. "And let's be clear," she added, her tone sharpening now. "What you just dismissed as subpar credentials, that's the same path walked by thousands of black and brown lawyers across this country. People who didn't have your privilege, your pedigree, your access. And every time you try to weaponize your Harvard degree to diminish us, you don't just insult me. You insult them." The words hit like a gavel. Gasps. A low rumble of voices. Reporters' pens moved furiously now, knowing this was the moment, the line that would dominate headlines and sound bites. Dershowitz leaned back, his smirk thinning into something taut, uneasy. He fidgeted with his glasses, then the papers again. The man who had owned the room minutes earlier was suddenly shrinking inside it. Crockett wasn't done. She pressed on, each line building momentum like waves crashing harder against a shore. "You want to talk about service?" she asked. "I didn't just practice law. I served in the Texas House where I fought for voting rights, for working families, for communities ignored by the powerful. And now I serve in Congress. Every step of the way, I've had to prove myself in arenas where no smirk, no title, no professor before my name could shield me. I had to earn it. Do you know what that's like?" Her eyes locked on him, and for the first time, Dershowitz looked away. The audience erupted. Not in full applause, not yet, but in that electricity of recognition. Heads nodding, eyes widening, a wave of whispers as though the room collectively, realized they were witnessing a turning point. Crockett let the moment hang, then delivered the blade. Credentials are not about where you study. They're about what you do with them. And while you've made a career of reminding people that you went to Harvard, I've made a career of reminding people that justice is supposed to belong to everyone, not just the elites who think they own it. The line detonated. Claps broke free, this time bolder, swelling into applause before the gavel of order could tamp it down. Someone near the front murmured again, "She's killing him." Dershowitz coughed, forced a thin smile, tried to wave it off with a dismissive gesture, but his fingers trembled slightly. He started to open his mouth, but the sound caught in his throat. For the first time in a very long time, Alan Dershowitz was visibly rattled. Crockett leaned back slightly, calm, as if she hadn't just landed a knockout blow but merely stated the obvious. That calmness itself was part of the strike. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need theatrics. The truth, sharpened by her lived experience, was spectacle enough. "And here's the irony, Professor," she added, her voice softening now, but with razor-edge clarity. "You think your dismissal makes me small, but all it really does is reveal your arrogance. Because if you need to diminish others to inflate yourself, that's not strength. That's weakness." The silence that followed was thunderous. Every reporter's eyes flicked back to Dershowitz, cameras capturing the beads of sweat beginning to form on his temple. The professor's hands shuffled his stack of papers again, searching for footing, but none came. His smirk was gone, replaced by a thin, uncertain line. The tide in the room had turned completely. The whispers now weren't about credentials or status. They were about her, Jasmine Crockett, the congresswoman who had sat still, listened, and then dismantled one of America's most celebrated legal figures with the poise of a surgeon. She leaned forward, eyes unblinking, and concluded her point with a simplicity that landed harder than any flourish. "You asked for standards, Professor. Consider them met." The crowd erupted. Gasps, claps, muffled cheers. It wasn't just admiration. It was catharsis, a release. The underdog had flipped the script and everyone knew it. Dershowitz looked small now, buried under the weight of his own arrogance turned against him. His allies avoided eye contact. His opponents smiled. The press knew they had their lead, the congresswoman who outclassed the professor. And yet, even as the noise filled the chamber, Crockett didn't bask. She let it flow around her, composed, dignified, because she knew the battle wasn't over. It had only shifted. And then came the pause. The camera flashes. The room alive with energy. Crockett's face resolute, Dershowitz visibly shaken. But the real shock came not from what she said, but from what happened next. The moment Crockett's final words left her lips, the room had already transformed into a live-wire storm of whispers, gasps, and scribbling pens. But the true explosion wouldn't come until hours later, when the confrontation leapt beyond those four walls and ignited the oxygen-rich arena of the Internet. It started with a single clip, a shaky phone. Video uploaded to Twitter within minutes of the exchange. The caption read simply, "Dershowitz tried it, Crockett finished it. Sue Crockett wins." By the end of the first hour, the clip had been viewed more than 1 million times. By the end of the night, it had gone viral across every platform. Hashtags surged into the trending list. Crockett wins. The Dershowitz owned. Credentials don't equal character. Memes flooded timelines, pairing Dershowitz's faltering smirk with Crockett's calm, devastating takedown. On TikTok, teenagers lip-synced her lines like they were dialogue from a blockbuster film. One viral video replayed the moment she declared, "Credentials are not about where you study. They're about what you do with them," over swelling orchestral music, turning her words into a rallying cry. Twitter timelines buzzed with political commentators who rarely agreed on anything but now found themselves aligned. Crockett had delivered the mic drop moment of the year. Journalists from major outlets framed it as a clash of eras, with one op-ed titled, "When Elitism Met Its Match." The flood of commentary wasn't just political. It was cultural. Celebrities weighed in, amplifying the moment beyond the usual news audience. An Oscar-winning actress tweeted, "Watching Jasmine Crockett in that room felt like watching history in real time." A Grammy-winning musician posted the clip on Instagram with the caption, "That's what it looks like when dignity wins." Within hours, late-night comedy shows had woven Crockett's lines into their monologues, replaying Dershowitz's shrinking expression to laughter and applause. But even amid the comedy, there was a deeper resonance, a sense that Crockett's triumph was more than a soundbite. It was vindication, not just for her, but for every voice ever dismissed by pedigree and arrogance. On the ground, her supporters erupted in celebration. Local community leaders in Texas called it a proud day, with one activist writing, "She didn't just win for herself, she won for all of us who've been told we're not enough." Across immigrant circles, social media posts framed her as proof of what resilience looks like, what fighting back against the old guard can achieve. Meanwhile, Dershowitz's camp scrambled. Anonymous sources whispered to reporters that he had been misunderstood or taken out of context. A press statement attempted to reframe the clash as spirited academic debate, but the damage was done. The visuals told the story, his smug dismissal followed by her calm dismantling. No press release could undo the indelible contrast etched into public memory. Conservative outlets tried to downplay it, running segments accusing Crockett of playing the victim card or grandstanding. But even their coverage backfired. Replaying her words only amplified them further. One host's sneer that she was all style, no substance, was instantly clipped, tweeted, and swarmed by commenters with links to her legislative victories and courtroom wins. Each attack only fed the cycle, deepening her image as the woman who had humbled the untouchable. The most powerful reactions weren't just in headlines or celebrity tweets, they were in the comment sections, the threads, the ordinary voices. That swelled into a chorus. A young law student posted, "Seeing Crockett stand up to Dershowitz made me believe I can stand up in my first courtroom." A black mother wrote, "For my daughter to watch a congresswoman who looks like her silence, a man who's tried to silence so many, that's everything." It wasn't just a moment. It was a shift. Crockett had become a symbol, not just of political strength, but of resilience against condescension, of the dignity in refusing to be diminished. And Dershowitz, he became a symbol, too, of what happens when arrogance goes unchecked for too long, when credentials become a crutch rather than a contribution. By the end of the week, polls showed a spike in Crockett's national recognition. Cable news debated whether this was her breakout moment, while social media had already decided it was. The clash had transcended politics, becoming a cultural drama, a story of hero versus villain that people retold in their own words, reshared in their own feeds, remixed into memes, GIFs, TikToks, and commentary. Vindication. Justice served. The underdog silenced the elitist, and in doing so, rewrote the narrative of who gets to claim authority in America. And yet, as powerful as the memes, headlines, and applause were, they were only the surface. The true impact of the clash wasn't in the punchlines or trending hashtags, it was in what came after, the deeper lesson that would linger long, after the cameras stopped flashing. Because beyond the memes and headlines, the real lesson of this clash was still to be revealed. In the days after the confrontation, when the noise of social media began to settle into something steadier, the significance of what Jasmine Crockett had done came into sharper focus. This was never just about one congresswoman defending her degree, nor about one man's smug dismissal crumbling in real time. It was about the story America tells itself, about who belongs at the table of power and what real authority looks like. Dershowitz had built his reputation on the idea that pedigree equaled truth. Harvard lectures, high-profile clients, and television appearances became his shield, his weapon, his currency. But Crockett had revealed something profound, that credentials without humility are hollow, and that service to people carries more weight than any framed diploma on a wall. Her composure in that moment wasn't simply personal strength. It was generational. It was cultural. It was rooted in the struggles of those who came before her. People who were told they weren't qualified, weren't good enough, weren't allowed inside the rooms where decisions were made. By standing calmly and refusing to shrink, Crockett reframed the meaning of power itself. The lesson was clear. Dignity beats arrogance. Service beats entitlement. Truth beats posturing, and it resonated because everyone, in some corner of their lives, has felt underestimated. The student told they'll never make it. The worker overlooked by bosses. The immigrant who speaks with an accent and is treated as less than. The young woman told to wait her turn. Crockett's rebuttal was theirs too. It was proof that when arrogance meets authenticity, authenticity wins. For many, the confrontation became a mirror. People replayed the clip not just for entertainment, but for validation. A reminder that calm strength can silence bluster, that justice isn't loud but unshakable. Her words weren't just lawmaker to professor, they were citizen to system, everyday person to elite, and that's why they carried. Because America, at its core, is built on underestimation. Time and again, the people deemed too small, too weak, too unprepared have been the very ones to bend history. From abolitionists to suffragists to civil rights activists, the story repeats. When those written off as powerless rise, they redefine power. Crockett's triumph, then, was more than a viral moment. It was part of that lineage, a modern entry in America's ongoing testimony that dignity is the nation's strongest currency. The moral cut deeper than politics. It wasn't Democrat versus Republican, left versus right. It was arrogance versus respect, dismissal versus acknowledgement. And every viewer could feel it in their bones. The universal truth that no title, no resume, no degree can outweigh authenticity backed by service. And that was the crescendo. Crockett reminded America that authority does not flow from institutions, but from integrity. That greatness isn't measured by how loudly one speaks, but by how deeply one serves. As the applause faded and the headlines rolled on, the story didn't just live in the clash itself. It lived in the inspiration it sparked. In the law student drafting her first opening argument, in the organizer planning her next rally, in the ordinary citizen who suddenly felt a little less small, a little more seen. Because Crockett's victory wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who ever carried the weight of being underestimated. And when the moment came, her calm precision had not only silenced arrogance in that room, it had left behind a lesson etched into the wider American story. That this nation is strongest not when the privileged guard the gates, but when underestimated voices rise, speak truth, and claim their rightful place. It was vindication. It was justice. But above all, it was a reminder. The measure of power is not who commands the stage, but who transforms it. And for Jasmine Crockett, in that unforgettable instant, transformation had become victory. Alan Dershowitz mocked Jasmine Crockett's law degree. He tried to turn her education into a punchline, her presence into a joke. But Crockett did what so many underestimated Americans have done before her. She turned mockery into triumph. That moment wasn't just about one woman standing up for herself in a crowded room. It was about the deeper heartbeat of this country, the belief that truth, not arrogance, wins the day, that justice, not entitlement, defines real leadership, and that Americanness is not measured by privilege, but by the courage to stand, to speak, and to serve. Crockett's calm, razor-sharp response will be replayed for years, not only because it humbled one of the most powerful legal minds in the country, but because it reminded us all of a timeless truth. Dignity is the strongest weapon. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to posture. She simply let her record, her service, and her unshakable poise reveal the hollowness of arrogance. And in doing so, she won more than the room. She won the story. And that's what we do here at State Shock. Capture the stories that define our time. Stories where justice collides with arrogance, where power is tested, and where truth rises from unexpected places. These aren't just debates. They are defining battles for dignity, identity, and the future of America. So, if you believe in moments like this, unforgettable clashes, epic takedowns, and the victories that prove underestimated voices can't be silenced, then join us. Subscribe to State Shock today, and be part of a community that refuses to look away when history is being made. Because this is more than politics. This is the drama of justice, and it's only just beginning.